NYPD conducted a massive sweep at a migrant shelter on Randall's Island today. The operation came as a surprise for the roughly 3,000 men and women staying there.
They came in the morning. They said that everybody go outside.
Crowds spent hours waiting.
So the NYPD is now raiding shelters where asylum seekers live, looking for weapons and contraband. And while critics say this is nothing more than the targeted harassment of people facing dire circumstances, proponents say these raids are necessary because some of the shelters are now so dangerous they put people's lives at risk both inside of them and outside of them as well.
Migrants make their way back into the Randall's Island tent shelter Friday evening after police evacuated all 3,000 occupants. Crowds spent hours waiting in the hot sun, while inside, the NYPD said it was conducting a sweep to search for, quote, dangerous contraband.
What are you going to do about the violence?
We're going to examine on how we continue to make which is untenable situation as safe as possible. It's a challenge.
This is a violent Venezuelan gang. It's infiltrated U.S. cities across the country from coast to coast. That man, Bernardo Raul Castro Mata, after his arrest, actually identified himself as a member of Tren de Aragua. And when he got to the shelter in the city, the 19-year-old was recruited by the gang and even given a gun.
They've done a huge recruiting efforts in places like New York City and Chicago, as well as other sanctuary cities.
Do you feel safe at the shelter?
100% no. Sometimes people just fighting without no reason.
Still others are gathered outside the Randall's Island shelter, claiming they have nowhere else to go because shelter stays are limited to just 30 days.
So New York is now raiding shelters it says have become dangerous but cost billions to maintain. But what nobody's talking about is that since the entire New York City asylum crisis is based on the idea of temporarily sheltering an unlimited number of people from anywhere on the planet, no questions asked, this result, the creation of shelters that are as dysfunctional as they are expensive and have now been co-opted by gang members, should have been a foregone conclusion from the very beginning. Because although this humanitarian crisis is more than a year old, the plight of asylum seekers in New York City is just as bad today as it was on the day this all started. Mass unemployment means very few of the 200,000 people who've come here on buses from the border have found meaningful work, let alone achieved economic self-sufficiency, allowing them to become part of our modern internet-connected workforce in a way that allows them to rent pricey apartments and put food on the table. And sadly, many asylum seekers are between a rock and a hard place. Either they can be forever unemployed, perpetually doomed to stay stuck at the bottom of the city's economic ladder, or as a small minority are now doing, they can team up with the criminal underworld, a tempting proposition in New York where our justice system refuses to lock up those who break the law, allowing crooks of all backgrounds the opportunity to prey upon New York businesses and New York residents over and over again as a misguided way of escaping poverty. And you know something? That brings us to the real reason why the entire asylum crisis here is such a mess. Our shelter system is unable to fundamentally care for people in a way that helps them safely get back on their feet. Why else are 65,000 people still living in these places? And why do many remain homeless, building tent encampments and living in abandoned vehicles parked near the very shelters they get kicked out of after their stays expire? And what do our lawmakers expect anyone exploited by this shelter industrial complex to say when the only people now offering to help them are gang members? So this right here is one of the city's shelters, the Roosevelt Hotel. It not only serves as a 1,000-bed shelter, it's also the welcome center for new arrivals. But unfortunately, this and every other shelter are now also used as potential hideouts and recruitment centers by gang members.
Queues of migrants make their way back into the Randall's Island tent shelter Friday evening after police evacuated all 3,000 occupants earlier in the day.
They came in the morning. They said that everybody go outside.
Crowds spent hours waiting in the hot sun inside the NYPD.
So this massive raid took place at the tent-style shelter over on Randall's Island, which holds 3 times as many people as this place does. And that's because for months now, gang members have been exploiting the shelter system, sneaking weapons inside to arm their members and control these places. And the exploit they identified was that food bags are not searched. Yes, there are metal detectors, but only people pass through those. Food items apparently go in separately. At least that's how things were getting done at these places up until recently. Now everything goes through metal detectors. But the real issue here is that having weapons inside these places has essentially turned them into no-go zones for the law-abiding, who they're supposed to be helping, defeating the entire idea of using shelters to help people get back on their feet. If you were to move into a place like this and you get in there and the same violent gangs control that place just like they did your home country, it's not just going to be unproductive, it's also going to be unsafe. To make matters worse, after this gang member turned whistleblower exposed how weapons are getting inside some of these facilities, the city admitted that their staff, who cost millions of dollars a year to run and maintain these places, weren't told that they needed to check the food items, which is something that happens to everybody who boards an airplane in this country by the TSA. Yet here, we don't, I guess, take security at our shelters seriously, or at least we weren't. Either way, the massive tent shelter that just got raided, it costs $20 million a month to operate. And because it's so dangerous, it's really less of a shelter and more of a minimum security prison.
Ibrahim Kaba says his discomfort is worth the police's protection.
It's good for our security, it's good for us, it's protect us, we don't know what is inside, so let's say if they have gun or
So the people inside the shelter, they know that it's dangerous in there, and they don't seem like they're entirely against the idea of a police raid that might remove things from it that make it dangerous. But sadly, this whole operation comes on the heels of a very tragic event because there has been gun violence taking place right outside that facility, injuring the people who live inside of it when a man attacked a large crowd of people indiscriminately. Now, the NYPD had already been investigating this event as well as other events that took place at shelters nearby. This one right here, like the Row Hotel, which had another violent incident of its own recently, when they decided, you know what, the best way to search this massive tent facility is to have everyone come out so that we can comb through it and then let them all back in. And during their operation, they also seized a whole bunch of illegal vehicles that were parked outside the shelter itself, some of which were stolen, many of which were unregistered. And in the past, it's come out that at shelters like the Roosevelt Hotel here, sometimes many of the vehicles parked outside of it are also illegal and unregistered. Earlier this year, the city removed a whole bunch of vehicles from in front of this hotel, which people were using as residences after they had been evicted from this very same shelter. Which doesn't really make sense. What kind of shelter system leaves people in a situation where they have to go live in a car when they get out of it? Who in the world is benefiting from such a system other than the people that own this hotel, which used to be bankrupt and is now making millions? Yet even though our shelter systems are run in a manner that just contributes to poverty and violence, local activists are not too happy about the way that the police conducted themselves when they forced everyone out of that big shelter and decided to raid it, claiming that the operation was both unjust and amounted to nothing more than targeted harassment.
The Legal Aid Society calls Friday's sweep unprecedented and draconian.
It certainly gives the impression of that they want to create a big show and send a message, not that they have a strategy here to actually identify.
So as you can see here, the local activists, they are not too happy about this raid. They're saying that the police didn't even have a purpose for going in there and clearing everybody out and combing through their stuff. Yet, the police are in a really tough spot because this is a gigantic tent. It's a one-room facility that we're talking about here. It's just one room. Where do people go if you need to search that room? The police say they had no choice. It's a complex of tents, just rows and rows and rows of beds inside. The tents are white. They've got security guards and fencing around them. And although this definitely was probably something very surprising and very alarming to the residents of that facility, it might have taken much longer if they just searched each individual tent rather than clearing the whole place and then having everybody go back in. And proponents of how the police took care of things say that this type of raid was long overdue, especially when we know that gangs are behind all of this weapon trafficking inside facilities just like this. Speaking of which, the police, they found a whole bunch of stuff, but they're not allowed to go through the backpacks and belongings that they located without search warrants, so they're waiting on those to see what's inside. And many people are probably happy that some of the illegal mopeds they confiscated have now been removed from the street.
The NYPD says its canine units did identify some bags during the search, but police are waiting on search warrants. The Legal Aid Society tells me that if anyone is subsequently arrested, their lawyers will look into if anyone's constitutional rights were violated during this sweep.
So interesting thing about this, even though there's probably stuff inside these bags that warranted their confiscation, especially since apparently dogs triggered when they sniff those very same bags. We can't just normalize warrantless searches no matter who the person is, because once that starts happening to one group of people in this country, many people rightly point out that it's going to start happening to everybody. Besides, the real reason criminals here are so anxious to get their hands on weapons is because every time they get caught with one, this city drops or downgrades those charges so that nobody ends up going to jail. And what you essentially have going on inside these facilities is an absolute mess. Inside, you've got criminals running rampant with weapons, and outside, you've got the police trying to protect everybody with one arm tied behind their backs. But the real problem here is these shelters, they're trying to accomplish something they are not designed to do. They're trying to get people out of them and into our economy and into our city as self-sufficient New Yorkers, but they're not accomplishing that at all, which is why gang takeovers of these places should have been something everybody saw coming. But bringing weapons into the shelter system isn't enough for these gang members. Now they want to start engaging in active combat with our law enforcement officers, which means police raids at various shelters may do little to quell violence from those who are already armed and already have weapons wandering our streets as we speak. So this idea that gang members are now going to actively seek out confrontations with law enforcement, not just in New York, but across the entire country, that's extremely frightening, because as somebody who's law-abiding, the only protection that I have or that you have from crime is the police. And what that means for New York is we could be on the cusp of a crime wave we've never seen before.
The violent Venezuelan prison gang known as Tren de Aragua has made a name for itself in the United States. And just in the last couple of days, Homeland Security Investigations has sent out a memo to its staff stating that there are direct threats to police in local areas.
So the information that we have on this comes from Homeland Security. They're the ones letting us know that these attacks could start in the near future if they haven't started already and we just haven't heard about it. And the gang that's in charge of all of this hails from Venezuela. And they're the same folks that are working on getting weapons into places that are supposed to help the needy. This gentleman right here attacked police officers in New York a few weeks ago. He was arrested and he exposed the whole weapon smuggling chain. And he said that he was recruited by this particular gang and given a weapon as soon as he got into the shelter. But as it turns out, this gang has been operating between Mexico and the United States for quite some time, but up until recently, their operations have been much smaller than apparently they're about to get.
Many of its members have been known to come into the United States in recent years. There have been about 70 encounters of Tren de Aragua members at the border. Now, in addition to that, they've done a huge recruiting efforts in places like New York City and Chicago.
So as it turns out, there have been about 70 encounters with known members of this gang at the border, but those are just known encounters with individuals that they've been able to identify as 100% being affiliated with this gang. It doesn't count all of the people who slip through the cracks or who come into the country and become gang members after. And the problem is these criminals, they're not just coming in and laying low. They're on massive recruiting pushes right now all across the United States, with their efforts focused on sanctuary cities where there is a critical mass of asylum seekers. And with the shelter systems in cities across the country absolutely failing the people who are inside of them, these gangs essentially have an unlimited pool from which to recruit active members from. And the scary thing about this is that in New York, all of our police, even our transit police, they've got so much on their hands. They're already short-staffed, and the idea of them now being targeted just for putting on a uniform and getting up in the morning to protect the rest of us is absolutely terrifying. But what's even scarier than that is it's recently been exposed that we don't even know how many gang members are able to sneak into the country because they're now doing things to hide their identities up until they're already here.
The ways that Tren de Aragua members are known to come into the United States is by infiltrating the southern border, and that's their main route. However, they've been sneaking in and getting past local authorities and their vetting procedures. And this is because they're not getting tattooed and any of the markings that show their...
So a couple of months ago, the U.S. government announced a new push to increase security at the southern border. But the problem is gangs, cartels, people exploiting the border, they're not just going to stop. They're going to adapt. And that's what these gangs are doing. Now they're telling their members, hey, don't get any tattoos. Come in looking like this and then get your tattoos after you join the gang and become active in the United States. That way you don't get caught on your way through. And if our security personnel are just looking out for specific tattoos and they don't see any, how are they going to know if somebody's a gang member if they don't have one? To further complicate things, apparently the Venezuelan government, who is not a friend of the United States on the international stage by any means, they don't share information about their citizens with our country. So any type of vetting is very difficult. Nonetheless, the United States has a generous program called Temporary Protected Status, which offers folks in disaster-ridden areas of the globe, like Venezuela, an expedited path to coming into the city and getting work permission and starting a new life. And if any of us were living in a war-torn part of the globe like that, we would be very happy to have the opportunity to leave and come to America. Nonetheless, there are people in Venezuela who aren't too happy about that, predictably their government. And the criminals, well, the criminals are very happy about it because now they're sneaking into this country under the guise of humanitarian refugees, taking advantage of the very same people who fled them and tried to escape the destruction they've already wreaked on that country. Plus, to make matters worse, it's apparently very hard to deport people from Venezuela once they get here because their government will not take them back. Apparently, Mexico takes some deportations, but they don't take everybody that the United States has on a deportation list, which essentially puts the United States in sanctuary cities like New York in a very tough situation. Thousands of people are still coming here, yet the system we have guarantees them temporary shelter and continued poverty because other than a cot in a big tent or a hotel room for a family, getting a job and becoming part of New York City is a lot harder than our humanitarian system seems to be advertising, and that's why it's failing so many people, especially when they're kicked out of these hotels in many cases after just 30 days, creating an opportunity for the worst elements of society, these dangerous gangs, to expand their operations right here. Is that what's happening? How would you reform New York City's shelter system? Can it be reformed? And what do you think about these gangs now wanting to target police? I think that's awful, to be honest with you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.